Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Collective Clicks podcast. This is your host, Brandon Bateman, and today I'm joined by Garret Cragun. If you haven't heard an episode with Garret, he is an absolute genius from my team that helps lead many things within the company. And we're talking all about split testing. How you doing today, Garret?
Doing great. How are you, Brandon?
Hey, I'm doing fantastic. Excited to be here. Excited to be talking to you again. I think it's been a while since we've had you on the podcast, and the world is missing your wisdom. So here we are.
I know. It's been a long time. I'm thrilled to be back in the fold.
Yes, we put a little work into this podcast today, and I'm excited to see what people think. This is honestly one, in my opinion, of the most impactful things that as a business owner you can understand, and that is how to test things. Because this is, at the end of the day, it's the only way that a company grows, is you have to test things. Unless you've got better intuition, a better gut than anyone. But I can tell you in my experience, nobody really does. It's like we all think we know something that we don't. And the only way to actually get better is to observe the data and learn how to get better. But there's a lot of really important aspects of split testing that people get wrong. So what we came up with here is what we call the 7 rules of split testing. This is 7 specific things that we do every single split test to make sure that we're making the most progress we possibly can. And this can apply to so many things. Like when I say split test, you're probably thinking like I'm testing ad A versus ad B. And yes, you can do this for that. This could also be in terms of how you're measuring acquisitions manager 1 versus acquisitions manager 2, or dispo rep 1 versus dispo rep 2. This is how you measure how a different drip campaign in your CRM affects your contact rate compared to another one. There is so much you can do with this information. And we use this all the time, like as marketers in the accounts we're working in, but we also use this all the time as operators of this business to learn and understand how we could do better. So that's why I'm super excited. Basically, the format here is just go through each one of these laws of split testing one by one. Garret, I'll let you kick it off.
Yeah. Okay. So the first one is to start with an actionable hypothesis that makes sense. And what I mean by makes sense is if you find a winner, it should fit logic of why it works. For example, it isn't a great test to see if we have our reps drink coffee before they go in the office and see how well they sell on their calls. If we find that they do happen to close better, does that make sense? And is that a thing that we would even do in our business, right? It has to make sense, and it has to be if there's a learning, that it's a learning that you can actually apply. So an example of a good test that fits this is REI. What kind of a video does better on YouTube? Is it a short clip that's of you at the property, or is it more of a B-roll video of you talking to sellers, shaking hands? Is it more of a hey, I'm buying things, or is it hey, I'm a person you can trust? That's a test that makes sense because it's based on true principles of marketing. Is it trust, or is it emotion that kind of helps you to buy? And then if there's a winner, you can make more of those videos and then test different things. So that's the first thing, is don't test dumb things that you can't build on just to be cute and test things. Because it's people will test button colors, and that sounds great, but that's not going to really matter, really. And if green is better than red, what does that mean? And how can you build off of that? It's a really small thing.
Yeah, well, I think what you're referring to, and we'll talk about this later, there's an order operations for testing.
Okay.
If there's 2 different offers you could use, why are you using 2 different button colors? Right. So when we build this hypothesis, we want to focus on the most impactful thing, because one thing I think people are missing when they think about split testing is they think you can do unlimited split testing. By the time we get through all these rules, what you're going to realize is you can't do as much split testing as you thought you could do, which means when you do it, it has to be surgical, and you have to know exactly what you're going after. Because if you're committing to do a split test for 12 months and it's not the right test, then you just wasted 12 months. So that's why this is so critical. I'll add one little piece of color to what you talked about. I've noticed that there's 2 different types of marketers, and I don't think either of them are right. The first type is usually very creative. These are your typical like brand marketers, your traditional like ad agencies, where they like come up with some of the best ideas you've ever heard of in your life, and they don't know how to use data. The other type is like a very direct response type marketer, where the stereotype is you just like, throw a bunch of stuff against a wall and see what sticks. But you're not really making those things that you're throwing against the wall really meaningful, or the differences between those things really meaningful. Because your whole game is like, I don't know what's going to work, so I'm just going to throw a bunch of stuff. And my honest opinion is the best marketers are kind of like a mix between those, because what you have to do is everything that you're testing has to be absolutely fantastic. It has to be things that individually you think will work, and you have your own hypothesis why you think that thing is better than the other thing. And then you also use the data to see it through. You can't be the person that just is so in love with your ideas, you never feel like you have to test them, but you can't be the person that feels like you're going to test anyways, so there's no sense in investing in each of the ideas to make them meaningfully good. Have you seen the same thing for marketers?
Yeah, and what I would add is there's value to building your process on proven foundations. So if someone has run the test that like X is better than Y, don't waste time doing it again. Start with what's established and test things that are unique to like your offering and your system. Don't waste time on things that have already been found to work well, and start from there. I think people will try to in at the wheel of a good landing page because they like how it looks, but there's a very established way that a good page is structured. Start there and then test beyond that.
Yeah, fantastic advice. All right, let's talk about number 2. Only change one thing. This is for a true test. This is so important. So here's how this works. I'll give when we think of testing, we often think of like landing pages. It's a good example of where A/B testing is really popular, right? So if I have landing page 1 and I have landing page 2, and I decide to change on landing page 2, I decide to make it better, and I decide to do that through, I want to change the headline, and then I also change the color of the page or something like that. Or in the topic of like bad hypothesis, I'll give another example. What if on landing page 2, I made the page speed better? Does that make sense to test? No, because you already know it's better, right? You're just wasting, right? So let's just say I do headline and color. So now if landing page 2 works better, I don't know if it's because of the headline that I changed or the color that I changed. Now I do know that landing page 2 works better. So ideally, split testing is like going to the eye doctor. If you've ever been to the eye doctor, they ask you, does 1 or 2 look better? And then you say, I like number 2. And then they say, okay, now does 1 or 2 look better? I like number 1. And you just keep on going. You just get incrementally closer and closer to the end product that you're looking for. That's exactly what it should look like. Now, there is one exception to this rule. If you just did split testing exactly the right way all the time, often you would miss out on being able to make major improvements. And that's where there is a different type of test called a C test. A C test is when you test something completely different to determine your starting place. And this is a common thing that you do at the very beginning. So I could take landing page 1 that looks completely different. It's almost like you're testing philosophy. Landing page 1 is all about scarcity. Landing page 2 is all about demonstrating benefits, right? And they're completely different. That's a C test. And there's a lot of different things that are different. So you're right. If landing page 2 worked better than landing page 1, I wouldn't know why it worked better. But what I could do is maybe make a big leap of progress right there. And then from there, do is A or B better? Again, is A or B better? Et cetera. It's just slowly dialed in. But I guess what I'm saying is that quality like split testing usually looks a lot more like evolution. Like picture like the monkey like slowly turns into a human than it does like pure creation. Like we just dream up this new thing and we just go right there. And that's the way to, like, so many people think I just want to completely retest this thing. And it just doesn't work. We recently were hiring someone for a leadership position on the team. When I interviewed them, they said one thing that told me before anything that they were very experienced. We ended up hiring this person. I asked him what changes he would make. He said, well, rule number 1 is I'm just going to change one thing in this department at a time. Otherwise, I don't know what made a difference. Realistically, if we're going to get the results that we want in this department, we're probably going to be at this for several years. But over the next few years, my goal is to get to this point. That's like the hallmark of, if you're talking to a marketer and how they're talking about their marketing campaigns, that's how they should be talking about it. If you're talking to a business leader, that's how they should be thinking about their department, right? Everybody who's like trying to test a bunch of stuff too fast, you just don't make the real progress that you're looking for. And you have to learn those lessons first and get that experience to learn that. And it feels like everybody just has to fail through that first to realize how important it is to just be slow, methodical, one thing at a time.
Yeah, this graphic, and it was like a bell curve of like how experienced a marketer is based on like how often they change things. And like a novice makes no changes. Like someone that kind of knows things makes a lot of changes. And an expert also doesn't make a ton of changes. Both ends don't change things a lot, but one's intentionally, one's just not knowing that they should, right? And I think that's the same for testing. Like just because you test a lot of stuff, that tells me more that you probably don't know what you're doing because you're panicking and throwing things at the wall with no order and no plan and no intentionality behind the testing. And so if volume of tests doesn't really indicate that you're doing well, it probably means that you're not doing it the right way.
Yeah, we just had a meeting this morning, a personal development meeting in our company where we talked about the difference between efficiency and productivity. Efficiency might be I have to launch 15 split tests. Productivity might be I'm okay launching 1 split test or 2 split tests, but I'm going to make more progress with those 1 or 2 split tests than the other guy's going to make with his 15. That's the difference, right? Productivity is about less, efficiency is about more. And I think too often when it comes to testing, we just get caught in that like efficiency mindset.
Yep, I agree.
What's up next, Garret?
Okay, next up is a big one, and it's to always test your 2 samples during the same time period. See all the time where people are like, let's run this version for this long, let's pause it, and then let's run this version and see how they each do. And this is kind of a variation of the last point of only change one thing. Let's say that if I manage our sales team and I say in this quarter, we are going to use this framework. Then in this quarter, we're going to use this framework. How much is different during those quarters besides the framework? It's the time of year. It's maybe like how well things are going in marketing. It's the people that came in the funnel during that time period. Maybe we added a different software. Maybe our email servers broke for an hour or two and emails didn't come through. Or maybe we changed how we train our team during that time. And if you're like, it's really hard to not change anything during a quarter just because you're doing an A/B test in the next quarter. Like that's just super inefficient. What's better is to just take half of your half of a controlled sample and give it the test and the other during the same time period to keep those variables of time and like seasonality controlled, because a lot can vary between, even like by doing a test like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then Thursday, Friday, Saturday, like people behave differently during those days of the week. So like keeping it like constrained even in that like time period can matter. So keeping time bound tests is so important to control things that otherwise you just can't control.
Well, and to bring a little bit of realisticness into this, sometimes you can't follow this rule. If we're making changes in a department, it's not like our people are robots and we can just let them like, hey, you're going to be this way one. Like, on Tuesdays, we're compensating you an extra $10,000 a year. And on Wednesdays, we're testing that you're getting a $10,000 less salary, and expect that we're going to learn how compensation affects our team's performance. Certain things you can't do this with, right? But you have to, the concept here is control as many variables as you possibly can. And if you're questioning this, I want you to think, when's the last time you saw a major change in performance, be it better or worse, when you thought you changed nothing? And I'm willing to argue that's pretty much all the time. We all experience it, right? There's always stuff changing that you're not changing in the market and things like that. So in certain scenarios, you can control this really well, right? Like for example, like most basic thing, a beginner person in Google Ads might run an ad, and then they might decide at one point, I really want my ads to talk about this instead. And then they change that. And then at some point they look back and they say, well, how have my ads been doing since I made that change? That's like a beginner version of Google Ads that really sucks. Really what you should be doing is running them at the same time, controlling all the other variables, testing how one does versus the other. There's some things that aren't quite that easy, right? Like I know you've messed around with, can we be testing our sales scripts and stuff like that, where it's like there's human behavior involved. So it gets really tricky. There's some even digital marketing stuff. Like for example, if you want to measure the lift of branded search campaigns, there's not a great way to do that in Google that I'm aware of. So what you can do is choose to run those campaigns every other day and then do that for 3 months and then aggregate all the data from the off days and then aggregate all the data from the on days. And then you're kind of controlling for time like the best you can by flipping the switch on and off versus having to be like all on and then all off. But it's a tricky thing, but if ever possible, you want to test them at the same time. I see this with marketing agencies all the time or something. I was working with this agency, then I switched to this agency and the results got way better. Then I switched to this agency and the results got way worse. And I'm thinking that happens to pretty much all of our clients all the time anyways. Even when they don't change agencies, like the results are always getting way better or way worse. And I'm willing to admit that because there's fluctuations, because even with consistent efforts, factors change in the market and in the environment that drastically affect the results. Even sample size drastically affects the results. So that's like a fact that we can't just ignore. It has a huge impact.
And that goes nicely into our next topic. Look at that. Transitions.
Yes. So the fourth one here is every test needs a numerator and a denominator. Let me be clear on what this means. You can't do a split test on volume. You can only do a split test on efficiency. The difference between volume and efficiency is a volume metric is how much of X do I get? Or an efficiency metric is how much of X do I get per Y? Some great examples of volume metrics would be like, how many contracts do I have? An efficiency metric would be how many contracts do I have per lead or per appointment or whatever the case is, right? So that's the difference between them. You have to define these things. I know this sounds like super basic, but when we get to some of these later steps, we talk about like, how do you know what the winner of a test is? There has to be a numerator and a denominator for some of these basic statistical tests that you can do. So you have to determine how much of X am I looking to get for Y? And that has to be determined as part of your hypothesis before you start the test, because that's going to determine how long you want to run the test and all those different types of things. So it sounds pretty simple, but you have to define what metric you're measuring. If it's a landing page, you're likely going to measure how many leads do I get compared to visitors to the landing page, conversion rate, right? There's your numerator and your denominator. If it's sales, you might measure how many contracts do I get from a certain number of leads. If it's an ad, you might be measuring how many clicks do I get per person that sees the ad. But that's the basics.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, it's important to have what you are measuring be what's most within the impact of the test. Like if I'm like going to change the images that I'm using on a Facebook ad, I'm probably not going to see how that impacts our contract fallout rate. Like that is just so far removed from it that it's not realistic. But you do still want to watch that. But if that's your like KPI, you're going to have a ton of data to get anywhere close to that being meaningful. And so like having that, what you are measuring and the like sample size has to be as close to what you're changing in the process as it can be.
Yeah. And actually, based on what you said, I would just add even one more thing. I think there's some balance to that too, in the sense that sometimes people make it too close in the process, right? So I gave some examples of things you can measure. I could tell you what typical marketers would do when they're testing a landing page, for example, is landing page 1, I'm looking at the conversion rate. Landing page 2, I'm looking at the conversion rate. But we're not taking into account, well, landing page 2 has a call to action that says, get your instant cash offer. It makes it sound like we're CarMax and there's just going to be a number showing up on your screen for how much your house is worth, versus landing page 2 says, talk with a specialist about us purchasing your home, which is a less strong call to action, right? So what you really want to measure in many circumstances, and this is one of the things that we're well known for, is basically measuring when we're testing a step deeper in the funnel than you usually would. This is a rule of thumb. Just go one step deeper. So we know, let's just say we're testing the landing page. We know the first metric is going to be the number of people going to the landing page, right? Like you said, it doesn't make sense to do contract fallout because then one of those numbers isn't right on the landing page, right? Versus the number of people going to their landing page, that's how many people are viewing it. Where most marketers would do is, and then how many fill out the form. Where we would probably do is how many end up becoming opportunities or something like that. So we're just going one step deeper, which removes some of the bias, because it's one of the biggest, like easiest ways to screw up your business with split testing is to test something that improves performance at one point in the funnel while degrading the next stage of the funnel. If you have an ad another example, if I was to write in all my ads, guaranteed highest offer you'll get, or whatever the case is. And all I'm measuring is how many people click my ad versus see it. What's going to happen? I'm going to have more people click.
Skyrocket. Oh yeah.
But what's going to happen then to my landing page conversion rate or the qualification of my leads? It's going to go down, right? So you don't want to be caught being one of those marketers where you constantly test things that basically make it so your top of funnel gets way bloated and then things drop off down in the funnel. You have to be really careful about that.
Yep. One thing that I just realized we haven't covered that might be helpful is the math behind an A/B test. What's a good sample size? What's a good, p-value? What is a p-value? All of those things. Do you think it would be worth it to go just super high level into kind of the math behind how to measure if you have a big enough sample size for your A/B test?
Yeah, let's do it. Absolutely. So you can go so deep into this stuff, but let's just talk super high level. So you've seen a normal distribution before, right? I think we've all probably seen that. It exists in nature. This is picture your bell curve, right? We've all seen this bell curve.
Height.
Yeah. So here's kind of the theory behind this. I mean, it's a hard thing for a human brain to grasp because we're not made for this. Turns out computers are really good at this kind of stuff. But the reality is just because you think you know something doesn't mean you know that thing. I'll give you an example. Let's just say I flipped a coin 3 times and I got 3 tails. The question I could ask you is, what does the data say about the rate that you get heads versus tails with that coin?
Right.
And the data, it depends on how you look at it, because the data says that 100% of the time we get tails. Is that true? Well, if it's a normal coin, it's not true. But then how do we observe data like that? It's because of sample size. That's the problem. If I continue to flip that coin 1 million more times, am I likely to have close to 500,000 tails? Yes, I'm likely to have close to that, right? So if you picture this, the bell curve starts out really wide. We've observed in the middle. We think we know that's what we're getting, but it could be way better than that, and it could be way worse than that. We don't know what it is yet. And then as you gather more and more data, your level of certainty gets higher and higher that you're close to the real number, right? So that's just the most basic thing before this. So let's just say you're doing a split test. It's each one of the things you're testing, the A and the B, they both have a bell curve. When it turns out there's some overlap between them, right? So maybe one coin I tested has 75% heads, the other one has 75% tails. So each one of those kind of has its own bell curve of distribution of possible likeliness. And essentially there's ways to mathematically calculate the likelihood that what I'm observing actually has enough data to reasonably assume what I think I can assume from this. So I hope that makes at least a little bit of sense. There's a metric called a p-value. This is what's called a frequentist approach to statistics. There's a metric called a p-value. And that metric, if you do a statistical test, basically tells you the likelihood that the test is misleading to you. And you want it to be a really small number. And if this all sounds complicated, I'm sorry, but I'll show you a really easy way to do this. Remember, every test has a numerator and a denominator. If you open up ChatGPT right now and you feed it your numerator and your denominator, you'll get an answer, right? So I could go to ChatGPT and I could tell it, I have one acquisitions rep and they had 30 leads and they have closed 3 contracts. I have another acquisitions rep that has 40 leads and has closed 2 contracts. Please run a statistical t-test to help me understand the probability that my first sales rep is performing better than my second sales rep. And ChatGPT could literally produce for you a mathematical percentage likelihood that the first sales rep is actually doing better. So you can see, well, is it true that there's a 95% chance that it's actually performing better? Or is it more something like 70% where you're looking at it oh, this guy's better than that guy. But the reality is there's not enough data for you to actually be able to say that yet. There's a 70% chance that's true, but there's not a 100% chance that's true, because while that sales rep is converting at 10%, really the only thing we know with 95% confidence is that they're converting at 10% plus or minus 7%. So we know that they're somewhere between 3 and 17, which isn't actually that close of a range. I hope this makes a little bit of sense. Is there anything else you could think, Garret, to make this a little bit more clear or actionable?
I mean, the way that I always think about this is, what is the likelihood that the results you got are due to chance, or would be the same if you ran that test again?
Yeah.
And if that number's high, that means it's probably just random. If it's low, that means it's because there is a true difference between those 2 tests.
And one of the things that you usually choose before you do a test is what you want that percentage likelihood to be. Like if I said I want 90% confidence in the decisions I make, you have to realize I'm making a decision that 1 in 10 of my decisions is going to be wrong. If I choose 95% confidence, I'm making a decision that 1 in 20 of my decisions is going to be wrong. But now I might need to run my test for twice as long to get enough data to have that level of accuracy. So you never eliminate the error. Like even if you get super, there's always going to be those scenarios where now there's a 1 in 1,000 chance. I've got enough data to where I'm like 99.9% sure. There's always the 0.1%. But the more data you get, the smaller that chance is. And what I think a lot of people are missing, you know what I hate with so much passion is when people talk and basically say things along the lines, oh, how much data is enough for a split test? 100 clicks. Or you could get at least 300 visitors to the landing page before you make a call or something like that. And you know what? Those rules of thumb guidelines could be good to like maybe estimate how long you need to run the test to get statistical significance. But the reality is you can't predict that, because if A works like 5 times better than B, we're going to learn that a lot faster than if A works 1% better than B. It's going to take us a really long time to get enough data to actually prove that's true. So we have to be really careful about that. And I would argue that most people, this is the number one thing they're getting wrong with their split testing. They are not seeing their split tests through to getting enough data to prove that one version is actually better than the other. What they do is they set up a test with good intentions, and then they see that one thing works better than the other, and then they lose their patience, and then they go with the one that worked better. And they forget that the fact that it worked better does not mean it will work better in the future. They're looking at the results over a period of time. They're not looking at like the overall performance. And you just need those bell curves that start out really wide to just narrow until you're confident enough that those numbers are pretty close to where they are, to where you can say, I'm okay with the level of uncertainty that I have in my decision.
Yeah. And I mean, I do it too. Like it's easy to be like, well, that looks like a big difference and it's ran for a while. So I need to see, lift quickly. And so I'll just roll with it. That way I can do my next test that I think will work. But you're like being exposed to a ton of risk by making a chance, because then you're building off of that with a new test and you're basing it off of a flawed foundation. And so it's important to make choices based on data, because then your next ones might be going down farther and farther down the wrong path, and all of a sudden you end up with a way worse outcome because each choice was made off of bad data.
Yeah, you know how this shows up in marketing a lot of the time is I'm doing an A/B test, and every time I pick the winner, suddenly that one doesn't work as well, because you're just using so little data. You just went after the one that had the most random variation in its sample, and it's bound to come down. Just like it's the equivalent of, let's just say I'm flipping a lot of coins and one of them gets me like 90% heads, and I jump into that one. Now, after I just chose that coin, do you think it's more likely to perform lower or better than it did originally?
Worse. It's worse because it overachieved at first.
Yeah, it's a statistical concept called regression towards the mean. It's the same thing that happens when, like, for example, you take 2 people that are extraordinarily tall and they have kids. What is the most likely height of their children? Turns out it is tall, but somewhere between how tall their parents were and the mean.
How tall they should have been.
Because from extreme values, you always regress towards a mean, because those extreme values more often than not include some type of random variation. So it's wild. Sometimes I picture marketing like everybody's just out there flipping coins and everybody's getting all excited. It's like the roulette wheel at a casino, right? It's hot now. It's definitely going to continue to stay hot, or it's cold. So, we got to be winning sooner. It doesn't work like that, right? There's just there's underlying statistical probabilities. But the takeaway here is, I know we're talking about like a lot of fluff, a lot of theory. Let's make it super clear. You literally type into ChatGPT, I have this many in my sample, and I have this many successes. And then for your other side of the test, I have this many in the sample, and I have this many successes. Run a statistical t-test to compare the performance. And it will literally write out for you which one's better and what likelihood there is that data is going to hold true in the future. It's so powerful. And you'd be surprised, there's people out there that you fired probably based on data that wasn't statistically relevant. It's insane. And there's landing pages you stopped using because of that. It's like when you start to view it from this lens, then you can reduce that error rate from, probably much higher to something like 10% or 5%, depending on what level of statistical confidence you're looking for, which is awesome. And I hope I didn't everybody with that, because it's so powerful, but it's so boring. I don't think it's boring, but it's just, it gets a little detail-y, and I think makes your brain work a little harder than you want to, and it's easy to give up. Garrett, you had the next one.
All right, so this one is all about having your A/B tests optimized towards revenue. So what I tell my team and what I try to do with each test is start with the test that is closest to dollars. And what the reason why I do that is like a test, its whole goal is like what's going to get us more clients, what's going to get us more contracts, right? And so I could say, let's try to get our ads to get as many clicks as possible. And eventually, like ideally, that's going to lead at some point to more deals. But what I could do instead is I already have these deals in the pipeline. Why don't we right now this week, try a different approach to how we dispo or how we work our leads. And that's going to have a much faster impact on your bottom line and be a much bigger swing than just starting way up here and hoping that it like kind of makes, sorry, I'm doing hands and this is an audio medium. But if I start like closer to the bottom, there's a smaller journey to getting where I want to go than starting really far and hoping that it follows the same path all the way down. Does that make sense at all, or is that really unclear?
Totally makes sense to me in the sense of like, be close to what you care about with the test.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the closer you are, the more likely it is that you impact that thing. If you're way upstream, you just don't know that it'll make it down that far. It could get diluted or something. And so you're kind of talking about like where to focus first, right? Which I think we talked about it a little bit as to, but here's the thing, after what I just told everyone, and this is the next point actually, is make sure you test long enough, which I kind of talked about before. So we're going to skip over it a little bit. But once you really understand how long you have to run tests for, which spoiler is way longer than a lot of people realize for things down funnel. And it's actually shorter than a lot of people realize for up funnel things. If you just want to test the click-through rate, it just
There's
takes
just more data.
You would think, because there's way more data. But if you're like testing which acquisitions manager is better, that probably takes, if I just had to guess, 5 to 10 times more time than you think it does, just off the top of your head, to know that one really does better from the other. And you can use the statistics to actually figure that out. But when you realize that, you realize I don't have the luxury of just saying, oh, well, we'll just test it. We've even gotten in this situation as a company before, where if we ever disagree on something, then we'd say, oh, well, we'll just test it. And then everybody agrees on testing it. And then somebody realizes, shoot, this test is going to take 12 months. And then what inevitably happens is we start the test, and then a month in, we decide that's not what we want to do anymore. And we just keep on starting, but not finishing all these tests. It's a horrible place to get into. So that's why it's so important to just choose the right tests in the first place. When you realize that testing is a finite resource, you should do, number one, prioritize. Remember, productivity over efficiency.
What I would add is that whenever I have my test documented, I use the PI acronym, which the P is going to be like the priority of the test, like is what we are testing a high like focus for right now of our team. The I is the impact, like how much impact do I think this is going to have on my like key indicator. And then E is the ease, like how easy and how fast can I get this test rolled out and get to a result. And so that to me is a helpful framework for knowing where to start, is like how fast can this go and get me an answer, and how much confidence do I have in this test actually working?
Yeah, 100%. That makes sense. I actually think so. That's kind of moving into our final point, which is documentation. I'd love to hear from you about your processes for documenting tests and why is it even important? I can tell you every visionary entrepreneur listening to this right now is like falling asleep because documentation of tests sounds like the
boring
in the entire world. But share your perspective.
Yeah, so I have all of our tests in a sheet. It's our whole backlog. Everything that we want to test is all scored and weighted and given like an order of when it's tested. And then we document for each test what was tested, why it was tested, the the data that we measured, the time frame of it, when the test ran, and and then what we learned from the test. And there's a couple key reasons for this. The first one is your team is probably going to change at some point, and people are going to leave. And if that isn't documented, people aren't going to know, one, why we do things. They're not going to keep doing it, and you're going to undo those learnings. And then the next reason is to not run those same tests again. Because if that's already been tested and found to have a good sample size, you probably don't have to run that test again for a while if you had a big enough sample size. Now, if it was small and you rushed it, then maybe it is going to be varied by market or by time of year. But don't do the same thing twice, and odds are, if it isn't documented, your team's going to say over and over again, why don't we test having a different way that we handle, price objections? And if we always do it every time, you're not gaining anything. But if it's documented, say, hey, like, we already did this test, here's the result, let's move on and build off of that learning and not do it over and over again. It's so helpful to have those things written down and documented, to have a history of how far you've come to keep moving forward.
Yeah, no, I'm 100% with you. And I know you're not like taking this direction because it's less on the topic of split testing, but I think this is actually a really like valuable nugget for us to leave with and help people better understand how you're speaking about this. And that's because what you're describing to me is also kind of your method of project management within your team, which is based on the concept of sprints. And so for anybody listening, can you help describe like this system? Like, why would you even do this system? And then how does it work this is basically a project management of testing your business operations or from a marketing standpoint within a company. And since we've implemented this, our productivity of our team has drastically improved. So yeah, I'm curious to hear just like beginning to end, what does this look like and how does this work?
Yeah, so how this goes is our team works in 2-week sprints where we begin and end a like fixed time where we work on just these X number of projects based on the bandwidth that we've decided each team member can handle. And we choose at the start of each sprint the projects that we've decided are the highest impact and will help us to make the most progress towards our established goals for that timeline. And then during those 2 weeks, we spend all of our time on just those things. And then at the end of it, we measure the impact of those tests. We gather feedback to inform our next sprint. I've heard it called a lot in marketing like a growth loop, where you run a test or do a project and then get feedback and iterate. And it's all based off of that sprint framework of doing as much as you can during a short time frame to get and receive rapid feedback. And it helps our team be efficient, know exactly what they're doing, base their time on what I has told them is like top priority and not what they feel is urgent or what they're told is like urgent by like their team members. But like I tell them like, hey, this is the focus right now. This is all you're doing. And then at the end of it, let's measure and assess and then build off of that. And it's all based off of tests and off of what's most important. And it's based off of, business goals. And so it helps the team to know what they're doing and how it impacts business outcomes.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And if this sounds familiar to anybody, it's based at least loosely off of something called an agile process of development, which is used frequently in the software development world. It's basically, if you look at project management, there's kind of two key like thinking groups. There's a waterfall where it's okay, this gets done, then that gets done, and that gets done, and that's the tasks. And that works if you have like highly structured departments, which we do have some highly structured departments, but we also have other departments that aren't that way, where something more like a agile development allows you to adapt and receive feedback a lot quicker, which I think is really important for marketing. Because in marketing, you can't lay out at the beginning of the quarter all the things you're going to test in the quarter, because based on the results of those early tests, the viability of the later ones changes. Let me tell you from a business owner standpoint what this means and what happened before we did this. It's all about priorities. What would happen is the most recent thing that I tell someone that I think needs to get done, that's the thing that they would focus on. And then I would later reach out to them and say, well, what happened with this? Something that we talked about 3 months ago. And they'll say, oh, I stopped working on that because I started working on this new thing that you put on my plate. And I realized I was producing a lot more stuff to get done than we had the hands to complete. And the really cool things about sprints, it's not like what it puts on your plate, it's what it takes off your plate. Because when you're at the beginning of a sprint, you thoughtfully decide what you're going to focus your time on for the next 2 weeks. And what that means is everything else that's not that thing isn't on your plate. And everybody's on the same page about what we're choosing to prioritize and what we're not. So what that, like, to me, what that is, it's like project management by design, not by default. Like, we don't just work on what's in front of us, what's the loudest, what feels most urgent. We work on what we have, like, in our right mind chosen is the most important thing. And more often than not, those are split tests. Like, literally is what we're doing as a company. Like, every department, we're split testing things all the time. We're split testing things for our clients. This is like at our core, like, we live and breathe this kind of iterative improvement because we want to be better every day. And this is the best way to do it. Thank you for sharing some of your brilliance with us today, Garret. You've made some massive changes to the way that we do some of these things, and you're the brain behind so much of this. For anybody else listening, I appreciate your time, and we'll see you next week.